The encounter. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the small town of Lincoln Falls, a place known for its serene suburbs and the rhythmic hum of crickets in the evening. The streets were lined with perfectly manicured lawns, where children played and neighbors exchanged greetings. It was a picturesque town, on the surface, but beneath that calm exterior, there lingered unspoken tensions, whispers of a past that some had yet to confront. Officer Ethan Connolly eased his patrol car down Oak Ridge Avenue, eyes scanning the street out of habit more than necessity. At 46, he was a seasoned veteran of the Lincoln Falls Police Department. His short-cropped hair was peppered with gray, and deep lines etched across his face told of years spent in a profession that often felt thankless. His badge gleamed in the evening light, a symbol of his commitment to law and order, a duty he took seriously. For Connolly, life had always been about discipline and control, enforcing rules to maintain the peace. He believed in his work and prided himself on being thorough and fair, at least in his own eyes. But there were rumors, whispers that he treated certain people differently, though Connolly dismissed them as nonsense. He was just doing his job after all. As he approached the intersection of Oak Ridge and Pine, something caught his eye. A sleek, black SUV cruising just a little too fast. Connolly's pulse quickened. He flipped on his lights and hit the siren, adrenaline surging through him. The SUV slowed to a stop near an old oak tree, and Connolly approached the vehicle, his hand resting lightly on his holstered gun. It was routine for him, an unconscious gesture of control. The window rolled down, revealing a middle-aged black man with salt and pepper hair, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. His calm demeanor and slight smile immediately threw Connolly off guard. "License and registration," Connolly demanded, his voice brusque, masking the subtle confusion brewing inside him. Without a word, the man complied, handing over his documents with a steady hand. As Connolly glanced at the license, a name jumped out at him: Chief Terrence Wallace. Connolly's heart skipped a beat. He knew the name. Wallace was the newly appointed police chief of Lincoln Falls, a position that had stirred quiet controversy among some in the department. Whispers about diversity hires, affirmative action, and outsiders taking over had been common in the locker room. Connolly had kept his mouth shut during those conversations, but he hadn't stopped listening. Swallowing his nerves, Connolly ran the information through his patrol car system. Everything came back clean, but the realization of who he had just pulled over hit him hard. With a tight chest, he stepped back to the SUV. "Chief Wallace," Connolly said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Apologies for the stop. I wasn't aware it was you." Chief Wallace gave a nod, his expression neutral, but his eyes held a gravity that unnerved Connolly. "No problem, Officer Connolly," Wallace replied, his voice calm and measured. "But before you go, may I have a word?" Connolly hesitated, the knot in his stomach tightening. "Of course, sir," he said, stepping back a little. Wallace opened the door and stepped out, standing under the soft glow of the street lamp, its light barely cutting through the fading twilight. Wallace's presence was commanding, not in a forceful way, but in a manner that suggested experience, patience, and wisdom hard-earned. His voice, though calm, had an edge to it, one that cut through the ambient hum of the quiet street. "Officer Connolly," Wallace began, "I know we've never formally met, but I've heard your name. You have a reputation in this department. Strict, thorough, by the book." Connolly nodded, unsure of where the conversation was heading. "I do my job, sir," he said, the words feeling more like a defense than a statement. Wallace's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "I don't doubt that. But I've also heard there might be, let's say, certain biases that influence how you approach certain situations." Connolly's jaw tightened. "I treat everyone fairly, sir," he said quickly, the familiar response automatic, even as a small voice inside him whispered doubts. Wallace nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure you believe that, Officer Connolly. But belief isn't always enough. Actions often speak louder than intentions, And I want you to consider this: who you stop, why you stop them, and how you treat them. Lincoln Falls is a community we're sworn to protect. All of it, not just parts of it. Connolly felt the weight of Wallace's words pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Wallace studied him for a moment longer before offering a slight nod. "Good night, Officer Connolly," Wallace said quietly, turning back to his vehicle. Connolly stood there for a moment, the sound of Wallace's SUV fading into the distance as he climbed back into his patrol car. His mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he sat in the silence, the implications of the encounter gnawing at him. That night, as he drove through the streets of Lincoln Falls, Connolly couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep inside him. Wallace's words had hit harder than he'd expected, leaving him questioning, something he wasn't used to doing. It wasn't just the confrontation. It was the reflection Wallace had prompted in him, the crack in the wall he had built around his beliefs and perceptions. At home, Connolly tossed and turned in his bed, unable to quiet his mind. The memories of his early days on the force flooded back. The lessons he'd learned from older, more seasoned officers, the jokes they'd made, the advice they'd given, often laced with casual racism disguised as common sense. He'd absorbed it all without question, never really examining it. As dawn began to break, streaks of sunlight cutting through the blinds of his bedroom window, Connolly sat up in bed, his eyes falling on an old photo on his nightstand. It was of him as a young officer, fresh out of the academy, standing proudly beside his mentor, Officer Jenkins. Jenkins had been his guide, his role model, the officer who had taught him everything about policing. But Jenkins had also been the one who'd instilled in him the deep-rooted beliefs about how certain people acted, how they were trouble waiting to happen. Connolly rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of his past pressing down on him, the realization of how his actions might have been shaped by forces he'd never questioned. For the first time, he felt a crack in the certainty of his worldview, a crack that had been widened by Chief Wallace's words. But what would he do with it? As he prepared for another day on patrol, Connolly couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something fundamental. His life, his career, the way he saw the world, would never be the same again. And it all began with a routine traffic stop that wasn't routine at all. A fractured reflection. Officer Ethan Connolly couldn't shake the events of the previous evening. Chief Terrence Wallace's words had left a mark deeper than any reprimand or critique ever could. As he sat in his small kitchen, staring at the untouched coffee before him, his mind replayed the encounter over and over. The look in Wallace's eyes, calm, steady, but piercing, was what disturbed him most. It wasn't judgment, it was something far worse. Understanding. Wallace had looked at him like someone who had seen his type before, a man caught in the cycle of beliefs he'd never questioned. The quiet of the morning in his apartment seemed suffocating, pressing against the nagging thoughts that had stirred to life. His phone buzzed, pulling him from the whirlwind in his head. It was a text from Mike Larson, his partner. "Mike, ready to hit the streets. Usual spot, 8 a.m.? Ethan replied with a brief thumbs-up emoji, not trusting himself to say more. He didn't know how to articulate what he was feeling. Hell, he wasn't sure he wanted to. But as he strapped on his utility belt, a strange sense of foreboding settled over him. Today would not be like any other. At the station, Mike was already there, leaning against their patrol car, nursing a cup of coffee. Larson was a big man, with the build of a former linebacker and the attitude of someone who'd seen too much, too fast. His brash sense of humor often rubbed people the wrong way, but Ethan had always found it a welcome distraction from the monotony of patrol. Until today. "Hey, Connolly," Mike called, flashing a grin. "Heard you had a little run-in with the new boss last night. What's he like? As stiff as he looks?" Ethan shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "It was just a routine stop. Nothing special." Mike chuckled. "Routine stop with the chief. Sure, buddy. You gonna tell me he didn't lay into you about his big equality agenda?" Ethan felt his jaw tighten but forced a neutral expression. It wasn't like that. He just talked. Mike snorted. Figures. Guy's too soft to really lead. You know the brass brought him in to make the department look better, right? All that political crap. Doesn't know the streets like we do. Ethan bit back a response, feeling an unfamiliar twinge of discomfort in his partner's words. It wasn't like this was new. Mike had always been outspoken about what he called the changing face of the force, the influx of new policies meant to address racial tensions in the town. But today, after Wallace's words had unsettled him, it sounded different, harsher. They climbed into the patrol car, and the morning began like so many others, routine, quiet, with the occasional traffic stop or call about minor disturbances. But for Ethan, something was off. Every time they drove past a group of people, his eyes lingered longer than usual, scanning faces in a way he never had before. He found himself questioning his own instincts, who he noticed and who he didn't. At one point, they rolled through Lincoln Falls' predominantly black neighborhood, Magnolia Heights, a part of town that had long been the subject of whispered disdain among the older officers. It wasn't an official no-go zone, but everyone on the force knew to be extra cautious there, or at least that was the narrative. Mike, always the loudest voice in the car, scoffed as they passed a group of young men hanging out on a corner. There's your next call. Bet you $50 they're up to something. Ethan glanced at the group, 5 young men standing by a beat-up sit-in, laughing and talking. To Mike, they were trouble waiting to happen. To Ethan, they were something else. People just living their lives. Nothing about them stood out as particularly dangerous. And yet, his gut reaction wasn't entirely different from Mike's. He said nothing as they drove on, but the silence between the two partners thickened, unspoken tension swirling like smoke in the air. For the first time in years, Ethan was questioning his own gut, questioning whether the instincts he had relied on for so long were really his, or if they were something inherited, ingrained, absorbed from years of training and exposure to the attitudes around him. They made their usual stop for lunch, grabbing burgers at the small diner by the station. Mike filled the silence with his usual banter, cracking jokes about the mayor's latest initiatives and how soft the town had become. Ethan, normally a willing participant, found himself tuning out, his mind drifting back to Wallace's face. Sometimes our actions speak louder than our intentions. The words haunted him. What had Wallace seen in him? What did he think Ethan was capable of? The doubt gnawed at him, hollowing out the certainties he had built his career on. As they sat in the car after lunch, a call came through the radio. A domestic disturbance in Magnolia Heights. Mike's eyes lit up with a knowing gleam, and Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. Called it, Mike said, shifting in his seat, ready for action. Told you we'd be back there today. Ethan pulled onto the street and headed toward the neighborhood, but his heart wasn't in it. As they approached the address, his unease grew. A small, modest house stood at the end of the block, its porch light flickering in the broad daylight. Several neighbors were gathered outside, whispering amongst themselves, eyes trained on the police car as it rolled to a stop. Mike jumped out, hand resting on his belt. Let's see what kind of mess we're dealing with here, he muttered. Ethan followed, his movements slower, more deliberate. A woman stood on the porch, wringing her hands. She was middle-aged, with weary eyes, and a look of fear that immediately struck Ethan as genuine. She glanced between the two officers, her gaze landing on Ethan. He saw something in her eyes. Hesitation, distrust. Is everything all right, ma'am? Ethan asked, his voice softer than usual. Before she could answer, a man burst out of the house behind her, wild-eyed and shouting. I didn't touch her. You hear me? I didn't touch her. Mike's hand flew to his gun. Stay where you are, he barked, stepping forward. The man froze, hands up, but his eyes darted wildly between the officers. Ethan stepped forward, putting a hand on Mike's arm. Hold on, he said quietly. Let's talk this through. Mike shot him a look of disbelief, but Ethan didn't back down. Something about the man's face told him this wasn't what it seemed. He turned to the woman again, whose face had softened, relief flooding her features. "He didn't hit me," she whispered. "It's a misunderstanding. He just got angry, yelled a bit. That's all." Mike was still tense, hand on his gun, but Ethan kept his voice calm. "We're here to help, ma'am. Let's just talk this through, okay?" The man slowly lowered his hands, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Ethan felt his pulse slow as the tension in the air dissipated. They weren't here to escalate, just to de-escalate. And for the first time in his career, Ethan realized how thin the line was between the two. As they finished taking statements and left the scene, Mike shot Ethan a look that was hard to read. "You going soft on me, Connolly?" he asked, half joking, half serious. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window as they drove back toward the station, the familiar streets blurring together in his mind. "I'm just trying to be fair," he said quietly. The rest of the day passed in a fog. Ethan felt the weight of each decision he made more acutely than ever. Every interaction, every stop, every glance felt loaded with meaning, with implications he had never considered before. And through it all, Wallace's words echoed in his mind, pulling him deeper into reflection. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the memory of his first day on the job drifted back to him. He'd been so sure of himself then, so sure of what it meant to be a cop, to be in control. But now he wasn't sure of anything. The breaking point. Ethan Connolly had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize. The job required it. Deal with the tough stuff during your shift, then leave it behind when you hang up the uniform. But ever since that fateful encounter with Chief Wallace, the lines had blurred, and his thoughts no longer obeyed the neat boundaries he had set for them. The simple act of pulling on his uniform each morning felt heavier now, like each button he fastened added to the weight pressing down on his chest. It had been a week since the incident at Magnolia Heights, and the tension between him and Mike had only grown. Mike had noticed the shift, and though he hadn't outright confronted Ethan, the digs and jabs had become sharper, more persistent. "You've been real quiet lately, Connolly," Mike had said that morning as they drove out to start their patrol. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. "Everything okay? Or is our new chief getting to you?" Ethan had shrugged it off, mumbling something about needing more sleep. But the truth was, everything Mike said grated on him now. The casual way Mike spoke about problem neighborhoods, and those people had once gone unnoticed by Ethan, maybe even echoed in his own thoughts. Now each comment felt like a dagger, prodding at the cracks in his conscience. Today, the patrol car felt smaller, more stifling than usual. The silence between them had grown more pronounced, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Ethan could tell Mike was itching to say something, to break the stillness, but instead, they drove on through the streets of Lincoln Falls. It was just after noon when the call came in. Shots fired near a local community center in the heart of Magnolia Heights. The words crackled through the radio like a jolt of electricity. Mike, always eager for action, snapped to attention, a grin flashing across his face. "Here we go," he muttered, flipping on the siren as they sped toward the scene. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his mind racing. The call was vague. No details on the shooter, no confirmation of injuries, just the ominous phrase, "Shots fired." As they approached the community center, a small crowd had gathered outside, a mix of anxious faces peering down the street. Ethan scanned the scene, looking for any signs of immediate danger, but everything seemed eerily calm. Too calm. Mike was already out of the car before they had fully stopped, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his gun. Ethan followed, his mind buzzing with a dozen questions. Where was the shooter? Had anyone been hurt? They were met by a young woman, probably in her 20s, who seemed on the verge of panic. "I heard gunshots from over there." She pointed toward an alley behind the community center. "I don't know if anyone's hurt, but..." Mike nodded curtly, motioning for Ethan to follow him as they moved toward the alley. The narrow space was flanked by high brick walls, casting deep shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The only sound was the distant hum of city life, a sharp contrast to the tension coursing through Ethan's veins. As they reached the mouth of the alley, they saw him, a young black man, no older than 19, slumped against the wall, his hand pressed to his abdomen, blood seeping through his fingers. His eyes were wide with shock, his breath shallow. "Jesus," Ethan whispered under his breath, rushing forward. Mike, however, stood back, his posture rigid. "Stay where you are," he barked, his hand still hovering near his gun. The young man looked up, his face contorted in pain and confusion. I didn't do anything," he gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan dropped to his knees beside him, reaching for his radio. "We need medical assistance here now," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Connolly, don't get too close," Mike warned, his voice tense. "We don't know if he's armed." Ethan shot him a look, disbelief and frustration bubbling to the surface. "He's bleeding out, Mike. We need to help him." Mike's jaw clenched. "I'm telling you, be careful. He could have been the shooter." Ethan's gaze shifted back to the young man, who was trembling, his hand slipping from the wound. He wasn't the shooter. Ethan could see it in his eyes. The fear, the vulnerability. This kid wasn't dangerous. He was scared. As Ethan applied pressure to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, the young man's breathing became more labored. "It wasn't me," he whispered again. "Please." "I know," Ethan said softly, his own heart pounding. "Just hold on. We're getting help." Mike was pacing now, clearly agitated. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he muttered, more to himself than to Ethan. "These neighborhoods, these people, it's always the same. Trouble just follows them." Ethan's blood boiled at the words, but he bit his tongue. There was no time for an argument. Not now. Not while this kid's life hung in the balance. But something inside him snapped, the simmering frustration he had been holding back for weeks, finally reaching a breaking point. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Ethan spat, his voice low but seething with anger. "He's a kid, Mike. A kid. And you're standing there like he's already guilty of something." Mike's eyes widened in surprise, clearly not expecting the outburst. "I'm just saying." "No, you're not just saying. You're making assumptions. You always do. And maybe I have too, but this is different. He's different. You don't know what happened here." Mike opened his mouth to retort, but the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air, followed by the hurried footsteps of EMTs rushing into the alley. They took over from Ethan, lifting the young man onto a stretcher, his blood staining their gloves as they worked to stabilize him. As the ambulance sped off, the crowd outside the alley had grown larger, their faces filled with concern and wariness. Ethan could feel their eyes on him, could sense the unspoken questions hanging in the air. But more than that, he could feel his own questions multiplying, gnawing at the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Mike stood by the patrol car, arms crossed, watching the scene with narrowed eyes. "You've changed, man," he said finally, shaking his head. "Ever since that talk with Wallace. You're not the same." Ethan stared at him, the words hitting harder than he expected. "You're not the same." Maybe Mike was right. Maybe something had shifted in him after that night. But for the first time, Ethan didn't feel like that was a bad thing. "You're damn right I'm not the same," Ethan said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm trying to be better. And maybe you should too." Mike didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said everything. The unspoken divide between them had grown wider, and Ethan knew there was no going back to the way things had been. Not after this. As they drove back to the station, the tension in the car was palpable. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was thick with the weight of things unsaid. Ethan stared out the window, his mind racing, replaying the day's events. The image of the young man in the alley lingered in his thoughts, along with Wallace's words. Sometimes our actions speak louder than our intentions. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that today, his actions had said something different. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward becoming the kind of cop, and the kind of man, he wanted to be. The rift widens. The atmosphere in the station had shifted since the incident in Magnolia Heights. Ethan Connolly felt it the moment he walked in the next day. A mix of curious glances, quiet whispers, and lingering stares. He had become the subject of conversation, not because of some heroic act, but because of the change people sensed in him. The friction that had emerged between him and Mike. It was subtle, but in a department like theirs, nothing went unnoticed for long. Ethan's shift began like any other. He donned his uniform in the locker room, the usual routine of tightening his belt, clipping his radio in place, and securing his badge. But everything felt different now, heavier, as though the uniform was somehow constricting him. He caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror and saw the uncertainty etched into his face. The image bothered him. He had always been sure of his role, of his identity as a cop. But now, every reflection felt like a question he wasn't ready to answer. In the past, Ethan had relished the camaraderie among the officers. Those jokes, the shared sense of duty, the feeling that they all had each other's backs. But now, the locker room chatter seemed distant, as though he was on the outside looking in. And then there was Mike, his partner of over a decade. Ethan had thought they shared the same ideals, the same principles. But after that heated exchange in the alley, something fundamental had shifted between them. Mike was already waiting at the squad car when Ethan arrived, leaning against the hood with his arms crossed. His face was unreadable, but his posture said everything. There was tension between them that neither had acknowledged directly, but it hung in the air, making the silence between them almost unbearable. "Ready?" Mike asked, though it was more of a formality than a question. His voice was gruff, and the usual banter was conspicuously absent. Ethan nodded, opening the driver's door. He had barely spoken to Mike since the confrontation, unsure how to bridge the growing chasm between them, or if he even wanted to. The morning passed uneventfully, but the undercurrent of discomfort grew stronger with each stop they made. Ethan found himself hyper-aware of every interaction, not just with the public, but with Mike. He noticed the way Mike's jaw tightened whenever they entered a minority neighborhood, the subtle way his hand drifted toward his weapon a little quicker than usual. Mike wasn't doing anything outright wrong, but Ethan had begun to see the patterns, the prejudices that he himself had once ignored. It wasn't until they responded to a disturbance call in a low-income apartment complex that the simmering tension between them finally boiled over. The call came from a complex on the edge of town, a place that had been the site of frequent complaints, domestic disputes, noise complaints, the occasional drug bust. When they pulled up, the building looked as rundown as Ethan remembered. The peeling paint, the broken windows, the smell of stale air that seemed to hang around these places. As they approached the third-floor apartment, they could hear shouting from behind the door. A woman's voice, high-pitched and frantic, mixed with the deeper rumble of a man's voice. Mike's hand instinctively moved to the handle of his gun, his face a mask of grim determination. "I'll take point," Mike said, his voice low. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Ethan nodded, though his stomach churned. These calls were always unpredictable, and his mind raced through a dozen possible scenarios. Was it a domestic disturbance? A fight gone wrong? Was there a weapon involved? Mike knocked sharply on the door. "Police, open up." The voices inside quieted for a moment before the door cracked open. A woman in her 30s peeked out, her eyes red from crying, her hand trembling on the doorknob. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Ethan asked, stepping forward slightly. The woman hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. It's fine. Just an argument." Before she could say more, a man appeared behind her, tall and broad-shouldered, his face contorted in anger. He shoved the door open wider, glaring at Ethan and Mike. "You cops need to mind your business," the man spat, stepping forward aggressively. "We're just talking." Mike was already on edge. Ethan could see it in the way his posture stiffened, his fingers twitching toward his holster. In an instant, the situation escalated. "Sir, back away from the door," Mike barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The man sneered, his lip curling. "Or what? You gonna shoot me? Just another black man, right?" The words hung in the air like a slap, and Ethan saw Mike's face flush with anger. Without thinking, Mike took a step closer, his hand resting on his gun. "You better watch your mouth." Ethan's heart raced. This was spiraling out of control. He could see the fear in the woman's eyes, the tension in the man's stance, and the rigid fury in Mike's every movement. It was like watching a fuse burn toward an explosion. "Mike, hold up," Ethan said, stepping between them. He turned to the man and raised his hands in a gesture of calm. "We're not here to hurt anyone. We just want to make sure everyone's safe." The man's eyes darted between Ethan and Mike, his fists clenched. "Safe? You think I feel safe with him, acting like he's gonna draw his gun any second?" Ethan felt the sting of the accusation, but he knew the man wasn't wrong. He could sense Mike's frustration bubbling over, could feel the raw tension that was seconds away from snapping. He needed to defuse the situation before things got worse. "Let's all take a breath," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. "We can talk this out. No one needs to get hurt." But Mike wasn't backing down. "He's acting like a damn thug, and you're gonna stand there and play nice. We need to get control of this before it gets out of hand." Ethan turned to face his partner, his own frustration rising to the surface. "Mike, this isn't about control. It's about listening. We don't need to escalate this." Mike's eyes blazed with anger. "Listening? Since when do we coddle these people? You've gone soft, Connolly." The words hit harder than a punch. Soft, that's what Mike thought of him now. A cop who had lost his edge, who didn't have the guts to do what needed to be done. But Ethan didn't see it that way anymore. He had seen too much, learned too much in the past few weeks to go back to the old way of thinking. He wasn't soft. He was trying to be better. To be the kind of cop that didn't contribute to the problem. "Maybe you've been too hard for too long," Ethan shot back, his voice cold. "We're not at war, Mike. These are people. We're supposed to protect them, not intimidate them." Mike's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the woman stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Please, stop. We're just scared. We didn't mean for it to get like this." Ethan turned to her, nodding gently. "It's okay. We're here to help, not hurt. Can you tell us what happened?" The woman's eyes flicked nervously toward her partner, who had backed down slightly but still looked wary. "It was just a fight. Things got out of hand. No one's hurt. I promise." Ethan exhaled slowly, relieved that the immediate threat seemed to have passed. "All right. If you're sure everything's okay, we'll leave. But if you need help, we're here." As they walked back to the car, the silence between Ethan and Mike was thick with unspoken resentment. Mike's face was a mask of anger, his hands clenched into fists. Ethan could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him, the widening gap between him and the man he had once called his best friend. "You really have changed," Mike muttered as they got into the car. "You don't even see it, do you?" Ethan turned to him, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I see it, Mike, and that's the point." The drive back to the station was silent, but Ethan's mind was anything but. The words from the confrontation replayed in his head, the anger in Mike's voice, the fear in the woman's eyes, the way the man had accused them of being just another set of cops ready to pull the trigger. It wasn't the first time Ethan had seen this kind of situation, but for the first time in his career he saw it differently. It wasn't about control, about force, about being the toughest guy on the street. It was about understanding, about seeing people for who they were, not just what they looked like. As they pulled into the station parking lot, Ethan glanced at Mike, who stared straight ahead, his face hard and unyielding. The rift between them had grown into a chasm, and Ethan knew there was no going back. But as he stepped out of the car, he also knew something else. He was on the right path, and for the first time in a long time, he felt sure of where he was headed. The burden of change. The morning light that filtered through the blinds in Ethan's kitchen was soft, but the mood inside the house was anything but. His wife, Sarah, stood at the sink, silently washing dishes while their young daughter, Emily, sat at the breakfast table, swinging her legs and munching on cereal. The room was filled with the quiet hum of daily life. But to Ethan, the silence felt heavy, oppressive even. Sarah hadn't said much since he'd come home last night. She hadn't needed to. She knew something was wrong the moment he stepped through the door, his shoulders slumped under the weight of an unseen burden. They had been together long enough for her to recognize when something was eating at him. But this time, Ethan didn't know how to explain it. How could he put into words the way his world seemed to be unraveling? The way his partner, his job, and his own identity were slipping through his fingers. "Are you okay, Daddy?" Emily's small voice broke through his thoughts. Ethan forced a smile as he looked at her, ruffling her hair. "Yeah, kiddo, I'm fine. Just thinking." But Sarah wasn't fooled. As soon as Emily finished her breakfast and scampered off to get ready for school, Sarah turned to face him, her brow furrowed with concern. "You're not fine, Ethan. You haven't been for a while," she said softly, drying her hands on a towel. "What's going on?" He let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck as he tried to find the words. "It's work. Things are complicated." "Complicated how?" Sarah's eyes searched his, but she didn't push him. She never did. She just waited, giving him the space to speak when he was ready. Ethan sat down at the table, staring at his hands. "It's Mike. And the job. I don't know. Everything just feels different now. Like, I'm seeing things I didn't see before, or maybe I just didn't want to see them." Sarah pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Like what?" He hesitated. How could he explain the shift that had happened inside him without sounding like he was turning his back on everything he'd ever believed in? How could he tell his wife that he was beginning to question the very foundation of his career, of the badge he wore with pride every day? "You remember that talk I had with Captain Harris a while back?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "The new captain, the one who pulled you aside after that traffic stop." "Yeah. It's been in my head ever since. He made me think about the way I do things, the way I see people. And he was right. I've been making assumptions about people, about black people, about anyone who doesn't fit the mold of what I thought was right, without even realizing it. I didn't think I was like that. But now, I can't unsee it." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing his words. "And Mike doesn't feel the same way." Ethan shook his head. "No. Mike's different. He thinks I'm going soft, that I've lost my edge. But it's not about that. I'm just trying to be better, to do the right thing. But now, every time we're on patrol, it feels like there's this wall between us. And the more I try to bridge the gap, the more he pulls away." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "Change is hard, Ethan, for you and for the people around you. But you're doing the right thing. I know it's not easy, but it's important. And it's okay if not everyone understands it right away." Her words were a balm to his soul, but they didn't erase the tension gnawing at him. It wasn't just about Mike anymore. It was about the entire department, the unspoken rules, the ingrained culture that he had been a part of for so long. Ethan wasn't sure how much longer he could walk the line between his old life and the man he was becoming. The tension in the station was palpable as Ethan walked in for his shift later that day. Conversations hushed as he passed by. Eyes followed him, and he could sense the quiet judgment in every glance. Word had spread about the incident at the apartment complex. Officers who used to greet him with casual banter now seemed distant, wary. Even Chief O'Malley, who had always been supportive, gave him a look that was hard to read. But the biggest change was with Mike. Their friendship had always been the cornerstone of their work, but now it felt like they were strangers. Mike barely acknowledged him. His interactions reduced to curt, business-like exchanges. Gone were the jokes, the camaraderie, the sense of brotherhood they had shared. It was as though Ethan's decision to challenge the way they did things had created an invisible rift that neither of them knew how to cross. The day passed slowly, filled with routine calls and mundane paperwork. But as the afternoon wore on, something changed. A call came in about a robbery in progress at a corner store in one of Brooksville's rougher neighborhoods. Ethan and Mike were the closest unit, so they were dispatched immediately. The turning point. The days turned into weeks, and the pressure that had been slowly building around Ethan now felt like it was reaching a breaking point. Every interaction at the station seemed tinged with a sense of alienation, a distance that hadn't been there before. Ethan could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, judging, scrutinizing every decision he made, every step he took. What had once been camaraderie now felt like a quiet but sharp division. And in the middle of it all, Mike, his closest friend and partner for years, had all but turned his back on him. Still, Ethan remained resolute. His mind kept circling back to that first conversation with Captain Harris, the one that had planted the seed of change deep within him. Over the years, he had unknowingly allowed his beliefs to solidify into something rigid, unquestionable, and dangerous. Now, each day seemed like a new confrontation with the man he used to be and the officer he was becoming. But there was a cost to his transformation. On this particular morning, the sky hung low with dark clouds, mirroring the heaviness Ethan felt in his chest as he parked his car in the station lot. As he walked toward the entrance, he spotted Mike standing outside, leaning against his patrol car, arms crossed, face set in a scowl. It wasn't the usual frustration. There was something deeper now, disdain, maybe even anger. Mike's eyes followed Ethan, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them crackled with everything left unsaid, the tension almost unbearable. "Connolly," Mike finally said, his voice cold. "We need to talk." Ethan sighed, his stomach sinking. He knew this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. "Yeah, I figured." They moved to a quieter spot, away from the main doors, out of earshot from their fellow officers. Mike's eyes bore into Ethan's as he spoke. "What happened to you?" Mike began, shaking his head. "You used to be the best partner I ever had. We were a team. But now it's like I don't even know you anymore. You've been acting like you're above all of us, like you're better than the rest of the department." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's not what this is about, Mike." "Then what is it about?" "You questioning everything we've ever done. Making us look weak out there. Hell, you made me look like an idiot at that robbery scene." "I didn't make you look like an idiot, Mike," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm trying to make sure we don't hurt the wrong people. You were ready to pull the trigger on a scared kid who was trying to help. That's your problem, Ethan." Mike snapped, his frustration boiling over. "You're so worried about these people and what they think of us that you've forgotten who we are and what we do. We're cops, for Christ's sake. We don't have time to coddle every suspect. You start second-guessing yourself out there, and people get hurt. You could get killed. Or worse, you could get me killed." Ethan looked at his partner, seeing the anger, the fear, and the confusion in his eyes. He knew Mike wasn't just angry because of one incident. He was angry because things were changing, and he didn't know how to deal with it. Ethan had felt the same way when this journey first began. "I'm not second-guessing myself," Ethan said quietly. "I'm just trying to be better. To be the kind of cop who protects everyone, not just the people who look like me." Mike stared at him, incredulous. "Is that what you think this is? That we're only protecting white folks? You really think that's what we've been doing all these years?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He could see the hurt behind Mike's anger, the feeling of betrayal. But the truth was clear to him now, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. "I think we've been protecting our own biases," Ethan finally said. "I know I have, without even realizing it. And I'm not saying it's easy to admit, but we got to face it if we want to be better." Mike's eyes flashed with disbelief. "So what, you're just gonna walk away from everything we've built? Everything we've worked for?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I'm not walking away. I'm trying to change it from the inside. And I need you to understand that, Mike. I need you to see that this isn't about turning my back on you or anyone else. It's about doing the right thing. We've got to do better." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Mike's chest heaved with barely contained anger, but there was something else in his expression. Something like uncertainty, even fear. He looked at Ethan, really looked at him. And for a brief second, the hostilities seemed to waver. "I don't know if I can do that," Mike finally said, his voice rough. "I don't know if I can be like you." Ethan's heart sank. "I'm not asking you to be like me, Mike. I'm just asking you to think about it. To try." But Mike just shook his head, stepping back. "I can't, Ethan. I can't. I've got a family to protect. I've got to survive out there. And the way you're going, you're not gonna make it." With that, Mike turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the cold morning air. The weight of their broken partnership settled heavily on his shoulders, but this time, it felt different. It felt final. As Ethan sat at his desk later that day, the door to Captain Harris's office creaked open, and the man himself stepped out, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing on Ethan. He gestured for him to come in, and Ethan knew it was time for a conversation he had been avoiding for weeks. When he entered the office, Captain Harris leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. "I've been hearing things," Harris said, his tone even. "You've been making waves, Connolly." Ethan nodded, not surprised. "I guess I have." Harris studied him for a moment. "Tell me something. Are you sure about this, about the path you're on? It's not an easy one, and it doesn't come without consequences." Ethan met the captain's gaze, his voice steady. "I know it's not easy, but it's the right thing to do. And I can't keep ignoring what I've been seeing." Harris nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. "I believe in what you're doing, Connolly. I really do. But you've got to understand something. Change, real change, doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't come without resistance. You're going to lose people along the way. Friends, colleagues, even the respect of some of the community you're trying to protect." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of those words sinking in. He had already felt the sting of isolation, the judgment from his fellow officers. But hearing it laid out so plainly by Captain Harris made it feel even more daunting. "But you're not alone in this," Harris continued, his voice firm. "There are people here who want to see things change. People like me. You're not the only one who sees the cracks in the system." Ethan felt a glimmer of hope at those words. He had been feeling so isolated, so disconnected from the very people he was supposed to trust. To know that there were others who believed in the same things he did, it was a lifeline. "Thanks, Captain," Ethan said, his voice soft. "I needed to hear that." Harris gave him a nod. "Keep doing what you're doing, Connolly. Just remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint, and don't lose yourself along the way." Weeks passed, and slowly the tides began to shift. It wasn't dramatic or swift, but there were small, meaningful changes. Ethan noticed that a few officers started coming to him with questions, asking about de-escalation techniques or how to handle certain situations without resorting to force. The conversations were tentative, cautious, but they were a start. The community, too, began to respond. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't unanimous, but little by little, people began to see that Ethan was different. He wasn't just another cop patrolling their streets. He was someone who listened, who cared, who wanted to do right by them. The anger and distrust that had once greeted him in certain neighborhoods started to give way to something else. It wasn't full trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. Ethan had a long way to go. His relationship with Mike was beyond repair, and he knew there would always be those in the department who saw him as a traitor, as someone who had broken an unspoken code. But he also knew that he couldn't go back to the way things were before. He couldn't unsee the truth he had uncovered about himself and about the world he had been living in. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets of Brooksville, Ethan stood outside the station, watching as the day faded into night. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he glanced at the screen, he saw a text from Sarah. "I'm proud of you." It was a simple message, but it filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. He smiled, pocketing the phone, and took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with the path he had chosen. It wasn't an easy one, and it wouldn't always be clear, but it was the right one. And that was enough. This was the story of Ethan Connolly, the cop who dared to confront his own bias, who risked everything to be a better man, and who, in the end, helped ignite the spark of change in a town that desperately needed it.